Stagecoach was instrumental in revolutionising the landscape of westerns for years to come. With dusty roads, cowboys, Native Americans and cavalry, director John Ford created a western that would popularise the genre as a key contributor to the 20th century Hollywood. In this scene, we see his use of the famous Monument Valley. Ford's use of this landmark has since created a mythic space within westerns. Leonard suggests that no other landscape within the genre appeared to be so full to the brim with literal and imaginary meaning. Rather than the A-Western's pattern of clumsy and protracted historical contextualizing, Ford relies on his iconography. Schatz notes that Ford's use of such genre convention delivers a powerful narrative with economy, efficiency, and simplicity. Here we have such an example, as some cavalry receive a message regarding the Apache.
How do we know he isn't lying?
No, he's a Cheyenne. They hate Apaches worse than we do.
Clear the wires to Lordsburg. That's Lordsburg now, sir. They seem to have something very urgent to tell you, sir.
Well, what's wrong?
The line went dead, sir.
What do you got there?
Only the first word, sir.
Geronimo.
Due to its historical significance, Geronimo was enough to locate Ford's story firmly within the 1880s. The town of Tonto is largely typical of the western town centre. Surrounded by horses and droves of ever-curious townspeople, Ford appears to reinforce the classical western, providing distinct boundaries between the town, with its organisation and relative peace, and the wilderness with its danger and savagery. And yet, whilst often held up as a classical western, Stagecoach is far from an exemplar of the western genre. Much of this innovation is related to the stagecoach itself. As the movie progresses, the stagecoach comes to act as an examiner of true character, taking its passengers from their everyday society into the midst of the desert and then, after various tests and trials, brought back to society, cast with far greater sincerity and insight. By confining the cast to such a small space, Ford creates a fluidity between supporting roles and main characters. Within typical Western films, a main character is usually identified through their clear baptism-like narrative, possessing an objective, a related obstacle, and a final confrontation of it. Even before we meet him, Ford compels us to expect Ringo to fulfill this, and yet he creates similar narratives for both Dallas and Doc Boone. In the opening scene, Dallas's journey is most available to us, as a saloon girl. Her objective is simply to be accepted within her community. Despite facing rejection universally within the stagecoach, Ford initially crystallizes her rejection from her community in that of Mrs. Mallory's, who distances herself from Dallas because of her perceived promiscuity, and yet we find her inquiring about another man herself.
Hardly a gentleman, Mrs. Mallory.
I should think not. He's a notorious gambler.
Ford implicates Mrs. Mallory as one of the values society cherishes. Ford diverges from classical Western convention by ironically attaching the song I Dream of Jeannie to Mrs. Mallory. In doing so, Ford paints a stark contrast between the gentle dreaminess of the song and Mrs. Mallory's actions. Doc Boone's character is also presented as a main character, occupying much of the dialogue throughout key scenes. His objective is much the same as Mallory's, desiring to be accepted by his community. The complication is, however, much different, a combination of his inability to stay sober and people's lack of trust in him as a physician. Ford magnifies this obstacle through the enabling of the whiskey samples that make their way onto the stagecoach.
He's a whiskey drummer.
What? Well, how are you, Mr. Haycock? Don't tell me, sir. I know, a familiar name and another name. I never forget a face or a friend. Samples?
Like Mrs. Mallory, the banker Gatewood is also held up as an upstanding citizen, yet as the film progresses, he too is shown to be false. Ford does little exploration into the two overt antagonists within the film, the Apache or the Plumber Boys. Instead, he seems to break from classical Western form in giving Gatewood the role of antagonist. The repetition of close-ups of Greenwood appears to confirm this, focusing in on the polarity between his public and private self. Ironically, it is the seemingly immoral characters that the Stagecoach journey eventually exonerates.
All aboard for Dry Forks, Apache Wells, Lee's Ferry, and Lordsburg.
Whilst being considerably different to its contemporaries, Stagecoach's linear narrative, iconography, and thematic choices do affirm much of the classic Western conventions. One such typical theme that Ford explores is civilization versus lawlessness and savagery. This is emphasized in the opening few shots of the film. Whilst the troopers are accompanied by triumphant score, the Native Americans are underlined by ominous and foreboding music. Though far from subtle, it epitomizes Ford's reluctance to rely on clunky dialogue to convey settings and narrative. In many senses, Stagecoach was a hybrid between the B westerns and the A westerns. Ford achieved this through combining the action sequences that often earmarked a cheap B western, whilst also entrenching his narrative within American history and mythology. This combination of history and tradition within the film is perhaps what has seen this film to be widely regarded as critical in reintegrating westerns into the A-list of Hollywood.
Pleasant journey, Mrs. Mallory.
Thank you. Goodbye. Goodbye.
Bye.